Thank you for the invitation to share in this webinar. It's the first one I've done. I'm not sure how it's going to go, but I hope it's going to be helpful to you. The title is, what does it mean to be a spiritual leader in the world and the church in today's context? And I guess the context, the immediate context, is of course the COVID-19 pandemic. That I guess you've reflected on a little bit already in some of your previous sessions, so I'm not going to spend time on that, but if that comes up later, we can have conversation. I want to draw attention to two other aspects of the wider context, just by way of locating ourselves for this conversation. The first is what I'd call the almost end of Christendom. Now, there's lots of books and lots of talks about the end of Christendom, but I kind of want to keep the almost at the beginning of that, because I think we're in a kind of transition. I think the forming of Christendom took a long time. So although Constantine is usually the marker, because Constantine was the first Christian emperor and put lots of the wealth and the weight of the state behind the church, and it did make a significant difference to what was happening. But the emergence of Christendom and the forming of Christendom took centuries to form. So, for example, you know, the dividing, the sort of AD, BC kind of divide probably is Bede, maybe a bit earlier. Saints' days, holidays, festivals were kind of formed over a period of time. I mean, I think it's interesting that the date of Christmas was fixed in the 3rd century. But we don't hear anything about Advent until the end of the 5th century, for example. So the kind of forming of a Christian year and the relationship between state and church took a long time to form. If you want a kind of recent exploration of that, Tom Holland's Dominion is really very interesting. He's a hugely good storyteller, but a great historian too, and kind of maps the forming of Christendom and Christian thought from before Christ to the present day. It's worth having a look. It's a long book, it's a big book, but it's worth having a look if you want to. The point I really want to make is that as Christendom took a long time to form, so it's slowly disappearing. Some things have changed already, some things have been dismantled, but other things continue on. So that places us in an interesting place. So whilst the church and clergy have experienced a loss of status in the last, say, 100 years, there are still many people, not just church people, who have huge respect and interest in and for clergy and church. And whilst we've lost a lot of the kind of common language of faith in the wider discourse, it still exists. It exists because it's become embedded in the culture. So when we look at films and books and theatre and so on, and we see theology in them, it's because those theological concepts, redemptive suffering, humility, sacrifice, have become deeply embedded in our culture. Now, this gives us kind of both strengths and disadvantages, and it depends which way and which things are dismantled as to what will happen. But we'll find ourselves in the next 20, 30, 50 years in the middle of that particular shift. The second thing about context is what I would call the new world order. And as many people have pointed out, we're in kind of what they call late capitalism. So the focus has shifted from investment, product, company profits to technology and financial markets. That's where the movements are. That's where the power lies in our current world. Of course, that last point's not completely new world. Both things exist. Companies still invest and do research and make products and sell them, but the thing is shifting considerably. And if you want to follow that through, you could read Catherine Tanner's Christianity and the New Spirit of Capitalism. And if you're not up for that, you could have a look at Theology Everywhere. 2 or 3 weeks ago, Richard Clutterbuck did a summary of that, which I found very helpful, and you might find it saves you reading the book. But it brings out really the shift that's happening in capitalism that we're part of and we're caught up in. Another aspect of that is really the tech giants. There's a very sobering article by Naomi Klein in The Guardian about 10 days ago, which talked about the agenda of the tech giants, you know, the Googles and such like. And in it, she paints a rather apocalyptic scene in which the tech giants are using the coronavirus to take more and more control. So the control of learning, of defense, of health, more and more falling into the hands of the tech giants. So the power is concentrated substantially with a small number of companies. Now, the pandemic has shown us how interconnected our world is and how vulnerable is the lifestyle that we've got used to and we take for granted. But imagine this, imagine a physical pandemic combined with a virtual pandemic. Imagine that we are isolated in lockdown and our main access through our tablets and phones and computers is controlled by others, and that some kind of malevolent virus begins to control that. That would make a very different kind of experience altogether. Chaos and confusion and the assertion of controlling power are not far below the surface in our current world. And we're living in these times of shift. So I think that in terms of exploring how we're spiritual leaders, all these contexts are important for us to bear in mind. So let's turn now to what I want to say about being a spiritual leader. This is kind of, it's not going to focus here, but I just want to say, if you haven't come across this book by Steve Croft, The Gift of Leadership, it's a small book, it's easy to read, it's in very short and helpful chunks, and I find it hugely helpful. If you haven't come across it, do get it and use it. I'm not going to concentrate on it because, well, for two reasons really. First, the book doesn't make any big claims about leadership. There's no magic answer, no set of rules on how to become a spiritual leader. Rather, it's a set of reflections on biblical passages, many of them drawn from the Hebrew Bible, expanding and expounding insights into leadership. And it's the sort of thing to read almost devotionally. You don't sit and read the whole book. To read a chapter takes you 15, 20 minutes. But it makes you think about leadership and how that's rooted and explored in the scriptures. But I'm not going to do that. And actually, in many ways, Steve's book was not written for our context. It was long before the pandemic. But it can nurture our sense of spiritual leadership by regular attention. And if you haven't seen it, I suggest that you have a look. So to the things I want to say, what things are kind of standing out for me in this current context about spiritual leadership? I want to draw attention to three things that I think we are recovering or need to recover in the current context. And of course, like a good Methodist, there are three of them. So the first is what I would call the recovery of holiness. The classical text about holiness in the Hebrew scriptures is Isaiah 6, where Isaiah's in the temple and he experiences an encounter with God, and it's transformative. And in that, he senses a new call in his own ministry. Now, we can date that pretty accurately, because we know it was in the year that King Uzziah died. And this is really significant because King Uzziah had been a good king. He'd reigned for 30 odd years. There'd been peace and stability, and now he was dead. And there was a kind of ushering in of a new future. We don't know what kind of future. They didn't know what to expect. And it's at this point that Isaiah encounters the holiness of God. One could make a similar case for Ezekiel in exile, Ezekiel chapter 1 and chapter 8. In both these encounters, the prophets have a sense of meeting God's holiness, of the mystery and wonder of God, and of their own sinfulness. In a time of crisis, a new sense of God's holiness is made apparent. Now, on one level, you could say, well, there's nothing you can do to recover that. It's a gift of God. It's a revelation. God gives this. It's not Isaiah who manufactures it. It's not Ezekiel who makes it up or somehow forces God to share it. No, it's an act of revelation. But we can remember that these two people, a priest and a prophet, were in a place of waiting and watching in the temple, by the river, watching, listening, waiting for God. And so I kind of think that one of the things that's speaking to me is that we need to recover prayer as waiting and watching. I think that's fundamental to our calling as presbyters. And I think in this COVID crisis, we've been discovering almost a renaissance about prayer. There are prayers everywhere, all day, every day, online, and some of them are wonderful. I listened to one this morning from a church in the Northwest. Very helpful. Helped me to pray and open my mind to God. But I sense that in this renaissance, this bursting out of prayer, that there is a calling to a deeper ministry of waiting and watching. Finding that prayer is not just about thanksgiving or intercession, but about developing waiting and listening, silence and stillness before the mystery of God. In 1 Kings 19, there's a great deal made of the fact that God is not in the mighty wind and not in the earthquake and not in the fire. But then God is found. And the traditional translation of that end bit is in the still small voice. The current preferred translation is the sound of sheer silence. Actually, of course, it's quite difficult to translate the Hebrew there. There aren't many other occurrences of this phrase. And so scholars just have to kind of pick around to see what they can make of it. My own sense is that the emphasis is on stillness. Where else it's usually after some kind of big storm. Imagine the Sea of Galilee and that great storm, and then afterwards it's still, absolutely still afterwards. And that's what this kind of word conveys. So there's a stillness in which God speaks. And I think part of the calling, and I'm speaking to myself as well as to anybody else, is learning to wait and watch for that stillness, in that stillness to hear the voice of God. Now, waiting of any kind is difficult, I think. We're gradually being weaned off waiting, aren't we? So when we want to book, we can do the one click on Amazon and it's on its way. I've discovered in the last few months that they tell me it's coming on Wednesday. It usually then comes on Tuesday. So it comes even quicker than I'd intended. We're onto that, aren't we? But we don't have to wait for it. We can get it quite quickly. In the early days of credit cards, there was a slogan which said, "Take the waiting out of wanting." Take the waiting out of wanting. We don't want to wait. And I think for Methodists, this is even harder. I think we're an activist church. Wesley rejected quietism. Now, to be fair, he rejected this kind of passive waiting on God for assurance in favor of actively attending to the means of grace. But that's not always how it's worked through in Methodism. When they do studies of Methodist churches, academic studies, they almost always come out saying this is an activist church. And if it's not an activist church, it wants to be an activist church. And it raises questions about what it means when you can't be active, what it means when you can't attend and participate. I think this kind of waiting is hard for us, and it requires time and attention and discipline. And it doesn't come easily, but I think it is the calling. You'll probably all be familiar with Michael Ramsey's famous quote when he was asked how much he prayed every day. And he said, 5 minutes. But it usually takes me 45 minutes to get there. And actually, I think something about waiting and watching in prayer that we need to be called to. And I think that sort of that kind of waiting and watching is not the opposite of activism. It's often the spur to action. So in the 1 Kings 19 story, when Elijah has heard what God has to say, then there's a whole series of actions, big political actions that take place, which change society and religion for the immediate future. Stillness and action might well lie together. I've made this a longer point, but I want to finish with this point with reading a poem to you. I found this really helpful. I came across it in the year I was president, and I found it really, really helpful, and it's kept on coming back to me. It's about a Friends meeting house, Quakers. You know, the Quakers are famous for two things, aren't they, really? They're famous for their silence and their waiting on God, and for their activism. You know, they punch above their weight. That's a bad metaphor for Quakers, but they kind of do more than you would expect for their size in the areas of peace and justice. Interesting. And the writer of this poem, Yue Fanthorpe, captures this by describing a meeting of friends. It's called the Friends Meeting House. This is how it goes. When the doors of the house are shut, eyes lidded, mouths closed, nose and ears doing their best to idle, fingers allowed out only on parole. When the lovely, holy distractions, safe scaffolding of much loved formulae have been rubbed away, then the plant begins to grow. It's hard to rear, rare herb of silence, through which the word comes. 3 centuries of reticent, meticulous lives have naturalized it on this ground. And the herb is the vine, savage marauderer that spreads and climbs unstoppably, filling the house, the people, with massing, insistent shoots that leaf through windows and doors, that rocket through chimneys till flesh melts into walking forms of green, trained to the wildness of the vine, which extracts such difficult witness, whose work is done in hopeless places, prisons, workhouses, in the counting houses of respectable merchants, in barracks, collieries, sweatshops, in hovels of driven and desperate. It's here, in the ground of silence. Okay, that's the first point, and I've made a lot of that. I'm going to go more quickly with the second 2 points. So the second calling, I think, that is coming to us is the recovery of being a spiritual leader as a mentor, a ministry of spiritual direction or spiritual mentoring. When I was in Durham in the 1990s, training ministers, 1 or 2 students came who had experience of a spiritual director. Now, by the time I left in 2010, everyone who went through training had either established a relationship with a spiritual director, had a spiritual group of guides, or had at least tried the possibility. This is in part, of course, because we encourage people to do this, to experiment with it and to find whether it worked for their discipleship and their ministry. But it also grew out of the hunger that people brought with them, looking for some kind of spiritual accountability and direction in their lives. I think the next step for us, having explored spiritual direction and having had supervision built onto ministerial development reviews, is to become more mentors to others in terms of spiritual growth. A few lay people have spiritual directors, but many do not. And actually, I think that that's one of the callings for each of us in our locality. I guess under cross kind of areas to pay attention to, guiding and guarding a community. In early Methodism, the equivalent role, that of helper or assistant to Mr. Wesley, involved not just preaching and travelling the circuits, but holding the leaders to account for their spiritual growth and for the care of those who were in their care through the classes. And the classes themselves were a kind of form of corporate spiritual direction. Now I'm hoping that we might recover some of that mutual spiritual direction, mutual accountability. Now, and the work on the Methodist way of life, which Andrew mentioned, is designed for that. If you haven't come across it, there's some stuff on the Methodist Church website, and there's a couple of videos around on YouTube. Methodist way of life is simply a kind of rule, a set of commitments that we make by which we will live out the life of Christ. And with it comes a set of questions which relate back to the commitments. So when it says we'll pray every day, we'll worship regularly with others, we'll look and listen for God in Scripture and the world, the questions ask you about that. What's happening in your prayer life? When has God spoken to you in worship or in the world? And it envisages that you would do this with someone else. You can do it on your own, you can reflect on your own, but my sense is both the honesty, the vulnerability, the openness that you can have with someone else that you trust will be more valuable. And I hope that by that, for many, that will begin to recover that sense of journeying together, holding each other to account, playing for each other, guiding each other with the resources and experience that we have. But if that does catch on, I think we're going to need more than ever those who are able to mentor and develop people as they grow. When I was researching on small groups a few years ago, I had some very interesting conversations with new church leaders. There was one church that was huge and growing and vibrant, and And it was really difficult to get a conversation with the church leader. I had to kind of use all the contacts I got to kind of arrange an interview with this person. And eventually he said, yes, I'll meet you. He said, I'd like you to come at 11:30 on such and such a day to Starbucks. So I thought, well, that'll be okay. So I met him in Starbucks, and he'd been there since 8 o'clock. And he was planning to be there until about 5 o'clock in the evening. And mine was the only interview. He'd had breakfast with the team that led the church, and they prayed and had breakfast together. He then spent the time after breakfast until he met me with 2 different people, mentoring them in terms of their Christian life. And after me, there were a series of others. And a big part of his role, he told me, was simply mentoring, talking through the spiritual development of people who were in the church at a certain point in their development. Quite challenged by that. Second conversation I had was with a minister who was working with a new church, a new church, not a Methodist church, and he said a very provocative thing. He said to me, he said, our church doesn't do mission anymore. I said, what? Your church doesn't do? No, we don't do it as a whole church, he said. We do it through our small groups. So we've stopped doing big plans as a church community. It was a community of about 90, and all of them belong to a small group of some kind. And he said, but the groups, they discern what they need to do, and I go and I work with them. I don't tell them what to do. I don't tell them to carry out the church's plan. I listen to their plans and I work with them on what they feel that God is pushing them to do, prompting them to do, leading them to do. And he said some of the ideas are completely off the wall. They are nuts and they're going to fail. And I try really hard to help people see that, but I don't stop it. And he said some of them are most remarkably creative and imaginative, and they're very fruitful. And he said what we've done is we've devolved responsibility for being a missioning, witnessing people to the small groups that meet. And my job is to mentor them. I kind of think we can't do what the new churches do. But I think there might be in this current situation where it seems that more and more people want to tune into prayers and worship than ever come to church, that there is a sort of there is a grouping that are hungry for spiritual things. And maybe part of our role is to mentor certain numbers so that that becomes part of the sort of way of being a Christian, to mentor each other in the ways of God. So that's the second point, rediscovery of spiritual direction. And the third point is what I call rediscovery of being a theologian. Now, when I first wrote this, I had the following words: recovery of the role of teacher, apologist, and evangelist. And then I felt, actually, I need to nuance that, so I added lots of other things, and then it was just far too big to go as a heading. And I realized that what I was resisting was the word theologian. And I think I know why I resisted it, but I do think it's the most appropriate. In the Methodist way of life, we're encouraging people to look and listen for God in the scriptures and the world. Now, I think in order to practice this holy habit, we need both language and models. Without theological base, people are going to have the most wild ideas about the nature of God. They need to be earthed. And ministers, we've invested greatly in people's ability to engage with theology in order that people can find the language and perhaps see the models in us of using that for discerning the presence of God and speaking of it in a creative way. It's interesting, isn't it, that one of the losses, I think, in the dismantling of Christendom has been the loss of language for children to talk about spiritual experiences. There's some kind of quite significant research work on this, that many children testify to in certain interview settings that they've had experiences of the transcendent, or experiences of God. But for many children, not all, but for many children, they don't have the language in which to express that. And I think that being a theologian is helping people find the appropriate language, which is kind of deep rooted in the New Testament and in the life of the church, which helps them to speak about what they've experienced, what they're encountering, what they're seeing, and how it's touching their lives. You've probably come across Anne Morris's notion of apt liturgy. She uses this partly in relation to the loss of language on the wide public sphere. She talks about it as words to keep the rumour of God alive in public events and occasions. I took my father's funeral a couple of weeks ago. Now, my family, none were Christian. I grew up in a non-Christian home, not going to church. We're now a kind of half and half family. Some are and some are not. And my dad was definitely a not. And he said he wanted me to take his funeral, but he definitely wanted it to be non-religious. So that was an interesting challenge for me to conduct my dad's funeral as a Methodist minister in a non-religious way. So I had to work for words to speak about him and the situation, which kept a rumour of God in the room without being religious. I think that's what Anne Morris is talking about. And I think she's talking about a kind of creativity between the audience, the context, and the tradition. A way of speaking meaningfully. And that requires being a good theologian, I think, because we don't have to use all the theological jargon, but we do need to know that there's a correspondence between what we say and how we articulate and the reality of the Christian faith. So I think that there's a calling to recover this area, and I think that's in teaching, apologetics, and evangelism. So as a teacher, helping people to understand the main planks of theology and to tackle the questions that they carry. As an apologist, to seize bridge building moments and remove some of the intellectual and emotional barriers that prevent many people from crossing the threshold of the gathered church. And as an evangelist, helping people recover their ability to speak of God. I'm going to finish with a little story. Many of you will know my wife died just over a year ago. And we had moved into the house we're in now in December when she was very ill. And we knew it wasn't going to be long before she died. So we'd bought our own house about 18 months before, and we moved into it in December before she died. It was very different to every other experience of moving to a house that I've ever had, because I've always moved as a Methodist minister. Always been welcomed by circuit stewards and local church stewards, always had food on the doorstep, always had neighbours who knew what your job was and what it was about, and so on and so forth. So we moved in, and none of our neighbours came and said hello. None. There were no circuit stewards, no stews and things left on the doorstep. Nothing of that kind. It was just different. It wasn't. I don't mean this in a sad way. That just didn't happen. And of course, we were not in a position easily certainly for Marion to meet our neighbours. So I thought, well, I at least ought to go and introduce myself. So I went round the immediate neighbours And I introduced myself and I explained who we were and why we'd moved in and where we'd come from and what the situation was with Marion and so on. And people were really nice and really welcoming, but I'd had to make the move. When it came to December, 6 months after Marion's died, I was kind of working on this way of life stuff. And I was looking at the thing of hospitality and thinking, what does that mean now for me? I know what it used to mean when Marion was alive, and we had people in our homes often for meals. So we would bring people together who perhaps wouldn't meet each other. We would have students living with us. We would have people staying over Christmas who couldn't move home, that kind of, move back to their own home, that kind of thing. What does it mean now for me? And I thought, it means I need to get to know my neighbours more. So I wrote a card, and a Christmas card and an invitation. I went round all my neighbours and I said, I'm going to have an evening of drinks and food, and I wonder if you'd like to come, and so on. Anyway, all my neighbours came. All my neighbours came. And I knew from the moment they arrived it was going to work. People from up the road and down the road arrived at our steps at the same time and started talking to each other, and the thing just went like that. People talked all night. I threw them out at midnight because it was getting late, but it had been a great success, and in many ways it kind of felt like it was a really good community event. And they said, oh, wish we'd done this years ago. When some of them who'd lived here for 20 years said, oh, actually I can remember we used to do this at one time, but we don't do it now. It's really great to do it. Since then, I've been asked by one of my neighbours if I would take a funeral. I've been asked by another of my neighbours what it is that Methodist Church is about. I've been talking to another set of neighbours who used to go to church and told me about the difficulties they had with their son who is on the autistic spectrum and found church incredibly hard, and church didn't cope very well with his presence, so they stopped going. We've opened up a whole series of conversations, and the challenge for me is how to talk into those about the nature of God for most people who don't have that kind of contact. So there's a calling to be a theologian. I kind of probably talked all the things I should say and probably gone on a bit longer than I should have done. But just to recap, I think in the current crisis, I think there's a calling to recover three things. A watching and waiting on God's holiness, God's character. Spiritual mentoring and apt theological ministry. Now, that may click for you, or it may just kind of think, what was that about? It's a chance to discuss that now in groups. I think someone else is going to take over and tell you how that works. I hope there's stuff there to talk about. These are the questions that I'm keeping talking because I'm expecting someone else to come in.
Thank you for that, Roger. I'll pop in. It's Alison.
Thanks, Alison.
Simon, can we stop sharing the screen? Thank you so much, Roger. That was really stimulating. My brain is buzzing with all sorts of stuff. I basically want a party as a result of that. We're going to go into small groups. Edel has placed us into small groups, so we'll have a conversation in there. We're hoping that the questions that Roger's posed for us are going to go in with us into the small groups with us. If for some reason they're not there, they're currently there in the group chat, we think that means they're going to go to the little groups. If they don't, we will rectify that.